My sister set fire to our childhood home and said, "It's not like you were using it." My parents died 6 months apart. Dad went first from a heart attack and Mom followed, as if she couldn't stand being here without him. They left behind a house that had been in our family for 40 years. The house where I learned to ride a bike. The house where I had my first kiss on the porch. The house where my father taught me to cook and my mother taught me to sew. The will was simple. The house went to me and my sister Jolene equally. We were supposed to figure out what to do with it together. I wanted to keep it. Jolene wanted to sell it. I told her I would buy out her half if she gave me time to gather the money. She said she didn't want to wait. She said the house was old and ugly, and she needed the cash now because her boyfriend Ricky was starting a business and they needed investors. I asked what kind of business. She said it was complicated and I wouldn't understand. I told her I wasn't giving her money for Ricky's complicated business. She called me selfish. She said I was always Mom and Dad's favorite, and now I was trying to steal her inheritance. I reminded her that I was offering to pay her full market value for her half. She said that wasn't good enough. She wanted the money now. Not in 6 months. Not when I could get a loan approved. Now. I said I couldn't make money appear out of thin air. She hung up on me. That was in March. In April, I drove down to check on the house because I'd been getting calls from the neighbors about activity on the property. I found the back door kicked in and half the furniture was missing. My mother's antique dresser was gone. My father's tool collection was gone. The china cabinet that had been my grandmother's was gone. I called Jolene and asked if she knew anything about this. She said she'd taken some things that belonged to her. I said those things belonged to both of us. She said possession was whatever, and I couldn't prove they weren't hers. I asked her what she'd done with everything. She said she sold it. I asked her for my half of the money. She laughed and said I should have been there to stop her. I drove home and started the process of getting a loan so I could buy her out and be done with her forever. The bank needed inspections, appraisals, and paperwork. It was going to take 8 weeks minimum. I called Jolene and told her I had the financing in process. I told her to stay away from the house until we could do this properly. She said fine. She said she didn't want to see that dump anyway. In May, the house burned down. The fire department said it started in the living room. Something about accelerant and multiple points of origin. They said it wasn't an accident. They said someone had set it on purpose. Jolene called me 2 days later. She said she'd heard about the fire and wasn't it just terrible. She said, at least now we could collect the insurance money and split it. She said the insurance payout would actually be more than the house was worth. So really this was better for both of us. I asked her if she burned down our parents' house. She said that was a horrible thing to accuse her of. She said she couldn't believe I would think so little of my own sister. She said I should be grateful that we were getting any money at all from that old pile of wood. The insurance investigator called me a week later. He had questions about Jolene. He had questions about whether she had financial problems. He had questions about whether she'd ever expressed a desire to sell the property quickly. I answered all his questions honestly. I told him about the furniture she'd stolen. I told him about Ricky's business. I told him about how she'd demanded money immediately. I told him everything. The insurance company denied the claim. They said there was clear evidence of arson, and they suspected the policyholders were involved. They said they were referring the case for further investigation. Jolene called me screaming. She said I'd ruined everything. She said Ricky was counting on that money. She said I was supposed to back her up and tell the insurance people it was an accident. I said I wasn't going to lie for her. She said I owed her because we were family. I said she burned down our family home. She said it was half hers, so she could do whatever she wanted with it. I said that wasn't how arson worked. She hung up on me again. Ricky left her 2 months later. His business failed because they couldn't get the investment money Jolene had promised him. He told her she was toxic and he couldn't be with someone who would burn down a house out of spite. I know this because Jolene called me crying about it. She said it was all my fault. She said if I had just sold the house when she wanted, none of this would have happened. She asked if I could lend her some money because she was behind on rent. I said no. She said I was heartless. I said she was an arsonist. The investigation went on for months. The detective called on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. I stepped into the empty conference room to take it, my stomach already tight with nerves. He said they'd gathered enough evidence to move forward with criminal charges against Jolene. I grabbed a pen from the table and wrote down the case number he gave me, my hand shaking so hard the numbers came out crooked. He explained the prosecutor's office would be in touch soon. I thanked him and hung up, then sat in that conference room staring at the case number for 10 minutes. My sister was going to be prosecuted for burning down our parents' house. The thought made me feel sick and relieved at the same time. The next morning, a woman named Megan Hudson called from the prosecutor's office. She had a kind voice, professional but warm, and she walked me through what would happen next. She explained that arson cases took time to build because they needed solid forensic evidence and financial motive documentation. She said the investigation had been thorough and they felt confident moving forward. I asked how long the process would take. She said it depended on whether Jolene took a plea deal or demanded a trial. I asked what she thought Jolene would do. Megan paused, then said people who burned down houses usually had trouble accepting responsibility. 2 days later, I drove downtown to meet Megan at her office. The prosecutor's building was gray concrete with narrow windows, and inside it smelled like coffee and copy paper. Megan met me in the lobby and led me upstairs to a small conference room. She spread papers across the table, photos and reports and bank statements, all organized in neat folders. She walked me through everything they'd collected. The accelerant patterns showed someone had poured gasoline in 3 different spots in the living room. Jolene's bank records showed she was $12,000 in debt with minimum payments she couldn't afford. The neighbors had given statements about seeing her car at the house around 10 at night, the same night the fire started at 11:30. Seeing it all laid out like that made my chest hurt. The evidence was overwhelming. My sister had really done this. Megan explained that Jolene would be arrested and arraigned within the week. She asked if I was prepared to testify if this went to trial. I said yes, even though the thought of sitting in a courtroom across from Jolene made me want to throw up. Megan nodded and made a note on her legal pad. She said she'd be in touch about the arraignment date. 2 days after that, Zoe showed up at my apartment with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. She'd heard about the charges being filed through the town gossip network. We sat on my couch eating lo mein straight from the containers, and I told her everything Megan had shown me. Zoe didn't try to make me feel better about Jolene facing prison. She just sat there while I cried about losing my sister, even though Jolene had brought this entirely on herself. Zoe refilled my wine glass and said sometimes people made choices that destroyed everything around them, and that wasn't my fault. The local news ran a story about the arrest 3 days later. They didn't name me, but everyone in our small town knew whose house had burned down. I went to the grocery store that weekend and got sympathetic looks from the cashier and the woman at the deli counter. Mrs. Fletcher from church cornered me in the cereal aisle and spent 10 minutes telling me how sorry she was about my family situation. Mr. O'Sullivan, who'd been friends with my father, squeezed my shoulder at the hardware store and said my parents would be proud of me for doing the right thing. The awkward conversations followed me everywhere. People wanted to show support but didn't know what to say, so they said too much or not enough. Jolene called me from jail the day after her arrest. I saw the unfamiliar number and almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She started screaming immediately, saying I'd destroyed her life by cooperating with the investigation. She called me a traitor and a liar. She said I'd always wanted to see her suffer. I listened for 2 minutes while she blamed me for everything, then hung up and blocked the number. My hands were shaking. I blocked her on social media too, every platform I could think of. 3 days later, a man named Liam Crawford called and introduced himself as Jolene's public defender. He had a smooth voice that made me instantly distrustful. He said he was trying to get information about our family situation and whether I'd consider writing a letter supporting leniency for my sister. I told him absolutely not, and gave him Megan's contact information instead. He tried to keep me on the phone, asking about our childhood and whether Jolene had any mental health issues. I repeated that he should talk to Megan and hung up. The arraignment happened on a cold Tuesday morning in early October. I sat in the back of the courtroom on a hard wooden bench, my coat still buttoned because the room felt freezing. Jolene was let in wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame. She looked thin and angry, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The judge read the charges and asked how she pleaded. Jolene said not guilty in a clear, defiant voice. When she turned to sit back down, our eyes met across the courtroom. She glared at me with pure hatred, like I was the criminal who destroyed everything. I looked away first. Megan called me that afternoon while I was driving home. She said Jolene had rejected a plea deal that would have meant 3 years in prison with possible early parole. Instead, Jolene was demanding a trial. Megan said Jolene apparently believed she could win by claiming I had motive to frame her, that I'd wanted the insurance money for myself. I asked if that defense could actually work. Megan said no, not with the forensic evidence they had, but it meant we were going to trial, and I needed to prepare myself for that process. I called the therapist's office the next day and made an appointment with Camilla Riddle for the following week. The receptionist asked what I wanted to discuss, and I said family issues, which felt like calling the ocean damp. Camilla's office was in a converted house on the east side of town, with a waiting room that had soft chairs and paintings of beaches on the walls. She came out to get me exactly on time. A woman in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. Her office had more beach paintings and a couch that wasn't the stereotypical therapy couch, just a regular one with throw pillows. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking about my parents dying and the house burning and Jolene getting arrested. The words came out in a rush like I'd been holding them back for months. Camilla listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally but mostly just paying attention. When I finished, she asked me how I felt about my sister now. I said I didn't know, that I was angry but also sad, and that it felt wrong to grieve someone who was still alive. She said that was actually very common in situations like mine, that I was mourning the sister I thought I had, and the relationship I'd wanted. We talked for the full hour, and she gave me homework to write down memories of Jolene from before everything went bad, to separate who she used to be from who she became. I scheduled another appointment for 2 weeks later, and left feeling lighter somehow, like naming the grief made it easier to carry. Taylor Howell called me 3 days after that first therapy session. He introduced himself as the fire marshal, who'd investigated the house fire, and said he needed to go over his testimony before the trial. We met at a diner near the courthouse where he spread out photos and diagrams on the table between our coffee cups. He pointed to burn patterns in the living room photos, showing me how the fire had started in 3 separate places at once. He explained about accelerant, how they'd found gasoline residue on the floor and furniture, how the pattern showed someone had poured it deliberately. Then he showed me photos of the smoke detectors, all of them removed from their mounts and placed in a neat pile in the garage. He said that was what convinced him beyond any doubt that this was arson, because fires don't remove their own smoke detectors. He walked me through his entire testimony, explaining each technical term and what it meant. The burn patterns showed the fire spread from multiple origin points. The accelerant residue proved someone used gasoline to start it. The disabled smoke detectors showed premeditation and intent. He said his job was to present the science and let the jury draw conclusions, but the science was absolutely clear. I asked him if defense attorneys usually tried to challenge fire marshal testimony, and he said yes. But in this case, the evidence was so strong that he doubted they'd get far. He packed up his photos and diagrams and shook my hand before leaving, telling me the truth would come out at trial. My apartment lease was ending in 6 weeks, and the landlord wanted to know if I planned to renew. I looked around the small one-bedroom with its beige walls and cheap carpet, and realized I didn't want to stay there anymore. The place had been fine as temporary housing after the fire, but it didn't feel like home. I started looking at rental listings online and found a small house on the south side of town that needed work, but had good bones, according to the ad. The landlord was a man named Archer Lombard who met me there on a Saturday morning. The house was old, probably built in the 70s, with faded blue siding and a front porch that sagged slightly. Inside it smelled like dust and old wood, but the floors were solid hardwood under the worn finish and the windows let in good light. Archer walked me through, pointing out what needed fixing: the leaky kitchen faucet and the bathroom tile that was cracking, and the back door that stuck in its frame. He said he'd give me a discount on rent if I was willing to do some of the repairs myself. Nothing major but painting and basic maintenance. I stood in the empty living room looking at the scuffed floors and dingy walls and felt something shift in my chest. This place needed someone to care for it, to fix it up and make it better. Starting fresh and a fixer-upper appealed to me in a way I hadn't expected, like maybe I could build something new instead of just mourning what I'd lost. I told Archer I'd take it, and we shook hands right there in the dusty living room. I signed the lease on Monday and got the keys that same afternoon. The first weekend in the new house, I bought paint and supplies and started on the living room walls. Zoe showed up Saturday morning with coffee and her own paintbrush, saying she wasn't going to let me do this alone. We painted the walls a soft gray that made the room feel bigger and brighter. She worked on the trim while I did the big sections, and we didn't talk much, just focused on the work. The repetitive motion of rolling paint onto walls was calming, almost meditative. I tried not to think about how I should be fixing up my parents' house instead, how I'd planned to restore the original woodwork and repaint the porch. Zoe must have sensed where my thoughts were going because she started telling me about her new job and the annoying guy in her department who microwaved fish in the break room. We painted until dark and ordered pizza, sitting on the floor of the empty living room eating from the box. She didn't mention the trial coming up in 6 weeks, and I was grateful for that, for just having a normal evening doing normal things. When she left, I stood in the middle of the gray room with its fresh paint smell and felt like maybe I could actually build a life here. The subpoena arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a process server who handed me the papers and walked away before I could ask questions. It was from Liam Crawford, demanding all my financial records for the past 3 years, bank statements and tax returns and loan applications. I called Megan immediately, and she sighed when I told her. She said this was a desperate defense strategy, that Liam was trying to prove I had money problems and needed the insurance payout. She told me not to worry because my finances were clean, and I'd been actively getting a loan approved to buy out Jolene's half. I gathered all the documents they wanted: copies of my bank statements showing steady paychecks and reasonable spending, my tax returns showing I filed properly every year, the loan application from the bank with all its paperwork. Looking through everything reminded me how hard I'd worked to do things the right way, to offer Jolene a fair solution instead of just taking what I wanted. I made copies of everything and sent them to Liam's office, then called Megan back to confirm she had copies too. She said the records would actually help our case by showing I had no financial motive for arson, that I was financially stable and willing to pay market value for the house. The subpoena had felt like an attack, but Megan turned it into evidence that supported my side of the story. The forensic accountant called me the following week, asking to verify details about the furniture Jolene had stolen and sold. She said her name was something I immediately forgot because I was too focused on what she was asking me to do. She needed me to go through photos of my parents' house and identify exactly what was missing, so she could track the sales and prove Jolene's financial desperation. She emailed me dozens of photos, pictures I'd taken over the years at family gatherings and holidays. I opened them on my laptop and started making a list. Mom's antique dresser that had belonged to her mother, solid oak with carved handles, Dad's tool collection that he'd spent 40 years building, every piece organized in its proper place, the china cabinet that came from my grandmother's house, full of dishes we only used at Thanksgiving. Looking at the photos brought back memories of every piece and where it came from. I remembered Dad teaching me to use his drill press, his hands guiding mine to keep the work steady. I remembered Mom showing me the secret drawer in her dresser where she kept old letters from Dad. I remembered setting the table with the good china for Christmas dinner, the plates so thin you could see light through them. Each missing item was a piece of family history that Jolene had sold for cash to fund Ricky's failed business. I sent the list to the accountant with photos attached, and then closed my laptop because I couldn't look at those pictures anymore. Megan called me on a Thursday afternoon with news that made my stomach hurt. She said Jolene had been telling people in jail that I was always jealous of her and wanted to steal her inheritance, that our parents loved her more and I couldn't stand it. The lies hurt even though I knew they were absurd, so disconnected from reality that they shouldn't have affected me. But part of me wondered if our parents' favoritism had contributed to how Jolene turned out, if being the favorite had made her feel entitled to things she hadn't earned. I thought about all the times Mom had made excuses for Jolene's behavior, all the times Dad had bailed her out of financial trouble. Maybe we'd all created the person who could burn down a house out of spite by never making her face real consequences. I mentioned this to Camilla at my next therapy session, and she said it was natural to look for explanations, to try to make sense of senseless destruction. She reminded me that Jolene was an adult who made her own choices, that whatever our parents did or didn't do, she chose to commit arson. The responsibility was hers alone. I knew Camilla was right, but the doubt still lingered, the question of whether things could have been different if our family had been different. Zoe convinced me to take a weekend trip to the coast to clear my head before the trial started. We drove out on Friday afternoon and checked into a cheap motel near the beach. Saturday morning, we walked on the sand with the ocean wind blowing our hair around and seagulls crying overhead. She let me talk through my feelings about the trial, how I wanted justice but didn't want to see my sister go to prison. I told her about the conflicting emotions, the anger and grief and guilt all mixed together. She listened and asked questions, but didn't try to fix anything or tell me how I should feel. We walked for miles until my feet hurt, and then sat on a piece of driftwood watching the waves. The ocean was gray and restless, matching my mood. Zoe said sometimes there weren't good choices, just less bad ones, and that choosing justice over family loyalty didn't make me a bad person. She said Jolene had made this situation by burning down the house and I was just refusing to lie for her. We stayed until sunset and then drove back to the motel for pizza and bad television. Sunday we walked the beach again before driving home, and I felt calmer somehow, more settled in my decision to testify. Megan and I met at her office a week before the trial to prepare my testimony. She had me sit in a chair across from her desk and ran through the questions she'd ask on direct examination. Then she switched roles and became Liam, asking hostile questions designed to make me look vindictive. She coached me on how to stay calm when he tried to paint Jolene as a victim of my manipulation, how to answer simply and factually without getting defensive. We practiced for 2 hours until my answers came naturally, until I could describe the timeline and the evidence without my voice shaking. She told me to look at the jury when I answered, to speak clearly and honestly. She said Liam would try to make me angry or upset because emotional witnesses look less credible, so I needed to stay controlled no matter what he said. We went over the likely questions about the furniture theft and my loan application, and my conversations with the insurance investigator. By the end, I felt as prepared as possible, though my stomach still turned over thinking about sitting in that witness chair. I drove out to the burned house lot for the first time in months on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The address was the same, but everything else had changed. They'd cleared away all the debris and hauled off the burned wood and melted metal. Just empty ground where 40 years of family history used to stand. The grass was starting to grow back in patches, covering the bare dirt. I sat in my car looking at the empty space and crying for an hour, grieving the house all over again. The physical place was gone, but the memories were still there. Every birthday and holiday and ordinary day lived in those rooms. I thought about my first kiss on the front porch that didn't exist anymore. I thought about learning to cook in the kitchen that was now just dirt and grass. I thought about my parents and how they'd loved that house, how they'd raised us there and planned to leave it to us. Jolene had taken all of that and burned it for insurance money she never got. I dried my eyes and drove away, knowing I wouldn't come back to this empty lot again. The night before the trial, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until 3 a.m. My mind kept running through everything Megan had coached me on. How to sit, how to speak, how to look at the jury without looking desperate. I practiced my breathing the way Camilla had taught me, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale. But it only helped for about 30 seconds before my brain started spinning again. I kept imagining Jolene sitting across the courtroom with that look she got when she was about to lie, the one where her eyes went wide and innocent. At 4 a.m, I got up and made coffee even though I knew the caffeine would make everything worse. I sat at my kitchen table going over my notes until the words blurred together. The house burned down in May. Jolene called 2 days later. She said we should split the insurance money. I had to say those exact words, in that exact order, without my voice shaking. By 6, I gave up on sleep entirely, and took a shower that lasted until the water ran cold. I picked out my clothes 3 times before settling on a plain navy dress that looked serious, but not like I was trying too hard. Zoe texted me at 7 asking if I needed her to drive me to the courthouse. I told her no, that I needed to do this alone, even though part of me wanted her there just so I wouldn't feel so sick the whole drive. The courthouse was bigger than I expected when I pulled into the parking lot Monday morning. All stone and tall windows that made me feel small walking up the steps. Security took forever, making me empty my purse and take off my shoes, and by the time I got through, I was already 10 minutes late. Megan found me in the hallway looking lost and walked me to the courtroom. The doors were heavy wood that made a sound when they closed behind us. Inside, the room stretched out with rows of wooden benches and a judge's platform that sat higher than everything else. I followed Megan to a table at the front and sat in the chair she pointed to. That's when I saw Jolene. She was sitting 20 feet away at another table with Liam next to her. She wore a gray suit I'd never seen before, and her hair was pulled back neat. She looked smaller than I remembered, more tired. When our eyes met for half a second, she looked away fast like I'd burned her. The jury box filled up with people who looked normal and bored, like they'd rather be anywhere else. 12 strangers who would decide if my sister went to prison. I tried not to stare at them, but I couldn't help wondering what they thought of us. This family that had fallen apart so badly we ended up here. Megan stood up when the judge told her to and walked to the center of the room. Her voice was calm and clear when she started talking, laying out everything that had happened like she was reading a grocery list. She talked about how Jolene needed money fast for Ricky's business, how she'd demanded I sell the house immediately instead of waiting for my loan, how she'd broken in and stolen furniture when I wouldn't give her what she wanted. Megan pulled up photos on a screen showing the empty rooms where Mom's dresser used to be, where Dad's tools had sat. She showed the jury Jolene's bank statements with the red numbers climbing higher every month, credit cards maxed out, rent payments missed. Then she showed the fire marshal's report with diagrams of where the fire started, how someone had poured accelerant in 3 different spots and taken out the smoke detectors first. Megan's voice never changed, never got angry or sad, just kept presenting facts like she was building a wall brick by brick. She told the jury they would hear from experts who investigated the fire. They would see financial records proving Jolene was desperate. They would hear from neighbors who saw Jolene's car at the house that night. She promised them the evidence would prove beyond any doubt that Jolene had burned down our family home for insurance money she never got. Then Liam stood up and everything shifted. He smiled at the jury like they were old friends and started talking about me like I was the villain. He said I'd always been the favorite child, the one Mom and Dad trusted more. He said I'd manipulated them into leaving me the house even though it should have been split fairly. He painted this picture of me as controlling and mean, someone who refused to help my sister when she needed money. He said Jolene had only taken some furniture that belonged to her anyway, things she had a right to as part of her inheritance. He told the jury I was angry at Jolene for standing up to me, so I'd framed her for arson to get revenge and keep the insurance money for myself. The whole thing was so backwards, so completely wrong, that I felt my face get hot. I wanted to stand up and scream that none of that was true, that I'd offered to pay her fairly, that she was the one who'd stolen and lied and burned everything down. But Megan had warned me this would happen. She'd said Liam would try to make me look bad because he had no other defense. So I sat there with my hands folded on the table and my jaw clenched, trying not to show how angry I was while Liam kept talking about poor Jolene, who just wanted her fair share. Taylor took the stand first after lunch, and I watched the jury's faces change as he talked. He had photos blown up big enough for everyone to see, burn patterns that showed 3 different starting points, tests that proved someone had used gasoline, close-ups of where the smoke detectors had been ripped off the walls before the fire started. He walked the jury through his investigation step by step, explaining how he knew this wasn't an accident, how the fire had been set deliberately and carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. He showed pictures of the accelerant trail, how it connected the living room to the kitchen to the back bedroom. The jury leaned forward looking at the photos. A woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth when Taylor showed the diagram of how the fire had spread. He talked about how unusual it was to find 3 separate points of origin, how that never happened in accidental fires, how the person who set this fire had wanted to make sure the whole house burned. By the time he finished, the courtroom felt heavier, like everyone was holding their breath. The forensic accountant came next with spreadsheets and bank records that told the story in numbers. Jolene's credit card debt climbing from $5,000 to $15,000 in 6 months. Cash deposits that matched exactly what she would have gotten from selling Mom's dresser and Dad's tools. Text messages between her and Ricky about needing $50,000 for his business. The accountant showed the jury a timeline that matched everything else. March, when Jolene first demanded I sell immediately. April, when the furniture disappeared and she got those cash deposits. May, when the house burned down. Every piece of financial evidence pointed to someone who was desperate for money and running out of options. The accountant's voice was dry and boring, but the information hit hard. Jolene hadn't just needed money. She'd been drowning in debt with no way out except the house she couldn't access, because I wouldn't sell fast enough. On the second day, neighbors took the stand one by one. Mrs. Fletcher from next door testified she'd seen Jolene's car parked at the house around 10 at night 2 weeks before the fire. She'd thought it was strange because the house was supposed to be empty. Mr. Sullivan from across the street said he'd heard shouting coming from inside the house one afternoon in April. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized my voice and Jolene's, and we'd been arguing loud enough that he almost called the police. Then Mrs. Rodriguez testified about a conversation she'd had with Jolene at the grocery store a month before the fire. Jolene had been complaining about me refusing to sell the house. Mrs. Rodriguez remembered Jolene saying she'd do whatever it took to get her money, that I couldn't stop her from getting what was rightfully hers. The way Mrs. Rodriguez repeated those words, whatever it takes, made them sound like a threat. Liam tried to make the neighbors seem unreliable, asking if they were sure about the dates and times, suggesting maybe they were confused or misremembering. But they all stayed calm and certain, and I could tell the jury believed them. Wednesday morning, Megan called my name and my legs felt weak standing up. The bailiff held out a Bible and I put my hand on it, swearing to tell the truth. The witness chair was hardwood and sat higher than I expected. Looking out at the courtroom from up there made everything feel more real and more scary. I could see Jolene at her table, staring down at her hands. I could see the jury watching me with blank faces. I could see strangers in the back rows who'd come to watch our family fall apart in public. Megan started with easy questions. My name, my age, my relationship to Jolene. Then she asked about Mom and Dad dying, and my voice cracked a little, talking about how Dad went first, and Mom followed so fast it was like she couldn't survive without him. Megan let me take my time describing the will, how the house was left to both of us equally. She asked what I wanted to do with it, and I explained that I wanted to keep it, that it was full of memories and I couldn't stand the thought of strangers living there. I told the jury about offering to buy Jolene out with bank financing, about the 8-week timeline the bank needed. Megan asked what Jolene said to that offer, and I repeated her words about needing money now, not in 6 months, not when I could get a loan approved. Then Megan asked about the furniture, and I had to describe finding the back door kicked in, walking through rooms that had been stripped of everything valuable. I explained about calling Jolene and her admitting she'd taken things and sold them, about asking for my half of the money and her laughing at me. My voice stayed steady through all of it, even though my hands were shaking in my lap where nobody could see. Megan asked about the fire, and I told the jury about getting the call from the fire department, about driving down to find nothing but ashes and burned wood. Then she asked about Jolene calling me 2 days later. I took a breath and repeated what Jolene had said, that at least now we could collect the insurance money, that the payout would be more than the house was worth, so really this was better for both of us. I watched the jury's faces change as I talked. The woman who'd covered her mouth earlier looked angry now. A man in the back row was shaking his head slightly. They could hear what I'd heard in Jolene's voice that day. The excitement about getting insurance money for a house that had just burned down with 40 years of family history inside it. Megan finished her direct questions and thanked me, then sat down. Liam stood up from his table and walked toward the witness stand, carrying a yellow legal pad covered in notes. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me with this expression that was supposed to seem sympathetic, but just came off as fake. He asked if I was angry at Jolene for wanting to sell the house. I told him no. I understood we both inherited it, and she had a right to her opinion about what to do with it. He asked if I was angry when she was rejected my offer to buy her out. I said I was disappointed but not angry, because I knew the bank timeline was long and she wanted money faster. He kept pushing, asking the same question different ways, trying to get me to admit I was furious with her and wanted revenge. I kept my voice calm and repeated that I wanted to preserve our parents' house and was willing to pay Jolene fairly for her half. His questions started feeling scattered, like he was throwing things at the wall hoping something would stick. He asked about specific conversations we'd had, trying to twist my words into proof I hated my sister. The jury looked bored. One man in the front row kept checking his watch. Liam finally asked if I ever considered that Jolene needed the money more urgently than I needed to keep an old house. I looked right at him and said that needing money doesn't justify theft or arson. I said I offered her a legal solution that would have given her everything she was entitled to, and she rejected it because she didn't want to wait 8 weeks. I said stealing our parents' furniture and burning down their house wasn't about need. It was about wanting money immediately no matter who got hurt. Liam's face got red and he said he had no further questions. I stepped down from the witness stand and my legs felt shaky walking back to my seat behind Megan's table. My hands were trembling and I tucked them under my legs so nobody could see. Megan called the insurance investigator next, a middle-aged man in a gray suit who'd spent months building the case against Jolene. He explained the denial of our claim in this flat, professional voice that somehow made everything sound worse. He talked about the clear evidence of arson, multiple points of origin, accelerant patterns that showed someone knew what they were doing. He described Jolene's financial motive, her mounting debts, the money she got from selling stolen furniture, the texts between her and Ricky about needing investment cash. He explained why the insurance company suspected policyholder involvement, how everything pointed to Jolene setting the fire deliberately. Liam tried to poke holes in his testimony during cross-examination, but the investigator had an answer for everything, backed up with documents and photos and expert analysis. The jury took notes. The woman who'd covered her mouth earlier was writing fast, filling up pages. When the investigator stepped down, Megan stood and said the prosecution rests. The judge called a recess until the next morning when the defense would begin. I went to the bathroom and threw up, then rinsed my mouth and went back out to meet Zoe in the hallway. She hugged me and said I did great on the stand, that I stayed calm and told the truth and that's all I could do. We got coffee from the courthouse cafeteria and sat outside on a bench watching people come and go. 3 days of testimony felt like 3 years. I couldn't imagine sitting through however many more days of Liam trying to defend Jolene. The next morning, the defense started with character witnesses, people who supposedly knew Jolene well enough to vouch for her. An old coworker said Jolene was always kind and helpful at the office. A woman from her gym said she was friendly and sweet. Someone who'd gone to high school with us 20 years ago said she remembered Jolene as a loving sister and devoted daughter. I sat there listening to these people who barely knew our family describe a version of Jolene that didn't exist. The coworker admitted under Megan's cross-examination that she hadn't worked with Jolene in 5 years. The gym friend said they only talked occasionally in the locker room. The high school acquaintance couldn't remember the last time she'd actually spoken to Jolene. Their testimony felt hollow, like reading a script. After lunch, Liam called Jolene to the stand. She walked up looking small and scared, wearing a plain blue dress that made her look younger than she was. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down, folding her hands in her lap. Liam asked her to tell the jury what happened the night of the fire. Jolene said she was home alone, nowhere near the house, watching TV and going to bed early. She said she didn't know anything about the fire until the next day when a neighbor called her. Liam asked if she set the fire, and she said no, absolutely not. She would never do something like that. Then he asked her who she thought might have set it. Jolene looked right at me and said she believed I did it to frame her. She said I was always jealous of her relationship with our parents, that they loved her more and I couldn't stand it. She said I wanted the house all to myself, and when she wouldn't just give up her half, I burned it down and blamed her so I could keep the insurance money. Her lies were so obvious and desperate that I saw 2 jury members exchange glances, their eyebrows raised. Megan stood up for cross-examination and her voice was sharp. She asked Jolene to explain her exact whereabouts the night of the fire. Jolene said she was home but started getting details wrong, saying she watched a show that didn't air that night, claiming she ordered food from a restaurant that was closed. Megan pulled out phone records showing Jolene's cell phone pinged off a tower near the house around the time the fire started. Jolene said the records must be wrong. Megan asked about the forensic evidence, the accelerant patterns, the disabled smoke detectors. Jolene said she didn't know anything about that. Maybe I planted evidence. Her voice got louder and angrier with each question. She started pointing at me, saying I ruined her life, I stole her inheritance, I turned everyone against her. The judge had to tell her to calm down. By the time Megan finished, Jolene looked guilty and unstable. Exactly what the prosecution wanted. Liam called no other witnesses. He stood up, said the defense rests, and sat back down. The whole defense case took less than a day. The judge announced closing arguments would happen the next morning and dismissed us. I walked out of the courthouse feeling numb. Zoe drove me home and made me eat something even though I wasn't hungry. That night I couldn't sleep. Just lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jolene sitting in that witness chair lying about everything. The next morning, Megan gave her closing argument, standing in front of the jury and walking them through every piece of evidence. She talked about motive, how Jolene needed money desperately, and saw the house as an obstacle. She talked about opportunity, how Jolene had access to the house and knowledge of where everything was. She talked about the forensic proof, the accelerant patterns and burn origins that showed deliberate arson. She talked about the witness testimony, the neighbors who saw Jolene's car, the phone records that placed her at the scene. She said Jolene made a series of choices that led to burning down her family home, and now she had to face the consequences of those choices. Megan's voice was calm and certain, laying out the case like building blocks that all fit together perfectly. Liam's closing argument was weak by comparison. He asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question whether the investigation was thorough enough. He suggested the investigators were biased because I cooperated while Jolene didn't, that they wanted to close the case quickly and didn't look at other possibilities. He said maybe I had financial problems nobody knew about. Maybe I needed the insurance money more than anyone realized. His theories felt thin and unconvincing, grasping at explanations that didn't match any of the evidence. The jury looked skeptical. When he finished, the judge gave the jury their instructions and sent them to deliberate. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Zoe for 6 hours drinking bad coffee that tasted like burnt plastic. My stomach hurt and I kept running to the bathroom thinking I might throw up again. Megan texted me every hour saying deliberations were ongoing. No verdict yet. Zoe tried to distract me with conversation about anything else, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. I just kept thinking about Jolene in that witness chair lying, about our parents' house burning, about 40 years of family history turned to ash because my sister wanted money now instead of waiting 2 months. At 4:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Megan saying the jury had reached a verdict. My stomach dropped and I grabbed Zoe's arm without meaning to. We walked back to the courthouse and the building felt different now, like something important was about to happen that couldn't be taken back. The courtroom filled up with people, and I took my seat behind the prosecutor's table where I'd been sitting for days. Jolene came in with the bailiff and sat down next to Liam, and I could see her hands shaking even from where I was. The judge entered and everyone stood up and then sat back down. He asked the bailiff to bring in the jury. They filed in one by one, looking tired and serious, not making eye contact with anyone. The forewoman was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She held a piece of paper folded in half. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and she said yes. I watched Jolene's face as the forewoman stood up to read it. For just a second, I saw something break through the angry mask she'd been wearing all week. She looked scared. Really scared. Like she'd finally realized this was actually happening and she might go to prison. The forewoman unfolded the paper and started reading. Guilty on count 1, first-degree arson. Guilty on count 2, insurance fraud. Guilty on count 3, destruction of property. Her voice was steady and clear, and each word felt like a hammer hitting wood. Jolene's face just fell apart. She started crying, these big, loud sobs that filled the whole courtroom. Liam put his hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off. I sat there feeling this weird mix of relief and sadness washing over me like cold water. Part of me felt good that she was finally being held responsible for what she did. Part of me felt terrible watching my sister fall apart. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Then he said Jolene would be remanded into custody until sentencing in 6 weeks. The bailiff walked over to her and she stood up, still crying. He put handcuffs on her wrists and started leading her toward the side door. She turned around and looked right at me. Her face was red and wet and twisted up with anger. She screamed that this was all my fault and she would never forgive me. Her voice was so loud it echoed off the walls. The bailiff kept pulling her toward the door and she kept screaming until they got her through it and the door closed behind them. I just sat there feeling numb. People were packing up their bags and talking in quiet voices. Megan came over and touched my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. We walked out of the courtroom together and stood on the courthouse steps in the cold air. Megan explained that sentencing would happen in 6 weeks, and there would be victim impact statements. She said I could speak if I wanted to, tell the judge how this affected me. I told her I needed time to think about what I would even say to a judge about my sister destroying our family legacy. She said that was fine and to call her if I had questions. Then she walked to her car and drove away. Zoe drove me home and I turned on the TV without really thinking about it. The local news was covering the verdict. They showed the courthouse and talked about the case. The reporter said it was a sad story about greed destroying a family. She said Jolene had let money become more important than her relationship with her sister. I watched for a few minutes and then turned it off. I didn't want to read the comments online because I knew some people would blame me for not protecting my sister or for cooperating with the investigation. Some people always find a way to make the victim the bad guy. The next few weeks were strange. I threw myself into working on the rental house. I spent whole days sanding the floors and painting the walls and fixing broken things. The physical work felt good, like I was building something instead of just watching things fall apart. I saw Camilla twice a week and we talked about everything. She helped me understand that I could grieve the sister I thought I had while accepting the reality of who Jolene actually was. She said those were 2 different people, and it was okay to be sad about losing both of them. On a Friday night, Zoe showed up at my house with bags of groceries and a few other friends I'd known for years. She said she was throwing me a dinner party whether I wanted one or not. We cooked together in my little kitchen and ate at the table I'd bought at a thrift store. Nobody talked about the trial. We just ate good food and told stories and laughed at stupid jokes. For a few hours, I felt almost normal, like I was just a regular person having dinner with friends instead of someone whose sister was in jail waiting to be sentenced for arson. After everyone left, I sat on my porch and thought about how grateful I was for people like Zoe who stuck around even when things got messy. I started writing my victim impact statement the next week. I wrote it and deleted it and wrote it again dozens of times. I tried to find words that would express what Jolene destroyed when she burned down that house. It wasn't just a building. It was 40 years of family history. It was every memory I had of my parents. It was my childhood and my grandmother's china cabinet and my father's tools and my mother's dresser. It was the porch where I had my first kiss and the kitchen where Dad taught me to cook. How do you explain that kind of loss to a judge who never met your parents or saw the house when it was still standing? Nothing I wrote felt like enough. The week before sentencing, I drove to the empty lot where the house used to be. They'd cleared away all the burned wood and debris. It was just flat dirt now with some grass starting to grow back. I sat in my car looking at the space and said goodbye to the house that didn't exist anymore. I thanked my parents for all the memories and promised them I would carry those forward even without the physical place to hold them. I told them I was sorry I couldn't save their house, but I did everything I could. Then I drove home and finished my victim impact statement. Sentencing day came on a gray Tuesday morning in November. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial. Most of the reporters had moved on to other stories. I sat in the front row with my statement folded in my purse. My hands were sweating and my heart was beating fast. I kept thinking about standing up in front of everyone and reading my words out loud. I kept thinking about Jolene sitting there listening to me describe what she took from me. The judge came in and we all stood up and sat back down. He called the case and asked if both sides were ready to proceed. Megan said both sides were ready. The judge nodded and looked down at his papers. He shuffled them for a minute and then looked up at me. He said my name and asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood up and my legs felt shaky. I walked to the front of the courtroom with my folded paper in my hand. The podium was wood and had a microphone attached to it. I unfolded my statement and smoothed it flat. My hands were sweating and leaving marks on the paper. I looked up at the judge and he nodded at me to begin. I started reading. I told him about the house that had been in our family for 40 years. I told him about learning to ride my bike in the driveway and having my first kiss on the front porch. I told him about my father teaching me to cook in that kitchen, and my mother teaching me to sew in the living room. I told him those weren't just memories anymore, because the physical place that held them was gone. I told him Jolene didn't just burn down a house. She burned down 40 years of family history and my parents' legacy and any chance we had of being sisters. My voice cracked when I said that last part, but I kept going. I told him about my mother's antique dresser that had been her mother's before her. I told him about my father's tool collection that he'd spent 30 years building. I told him about the china cabinet with the dishes my grandmother brought from Poland. I told him all of it was gone, and I would never get any of it back. I folded the paper and went back to my seat. My hands were still shaking. The judge thanked me and made a note on his papers. Then he looked at Liam and asked if the defense wanted to present anything before sentencing. Liam stood up with a folder full of papers. He walked to the podium and started talking about character letters. He said people who knew Jolene had written to the court describing her as a good person who made a terrible mistake. He said she was under extreme financial stress when this happened. He said Ricky had pressured her about the investment money, and she felt trapped. He said she deserved a chance at rehabilitation instead of a long prison sentence. He suggested maybe 3 years with 5 years of probation after that. He said that would serve justice better than locking her up for a decade. He talked for 10 minutes about how Jolene could turn her life around if the court showed mercy. I sat there listening to him make excuses for what she did. The judge's face didn't show anything. He just listened and took notes. When Liam finished, the judge asked Jolene if she wanted to make a statement. She stood up and walked to the podium. She looked smaller than I remembered. She had her hair pulled back and was wearing the same clothes she'd worn during the trial. She put her hands on the podium and looked at the judge. She said she was sorry for any pain this situation had caused. She said she knew losing the house was hard for everyone. But then she said she didn't set the fire. She said she hoped someday I would admit what I did and she could clear her name. She said she forgave me for lying to the police and the insurance company. She said she forgave me for turning everyone against her. She said family was supposed to stick together, but I had chosen revenge over loyalty. The judge's eyebrows went up a little when she said that. She talked for another few minutes about how unfair the trial had been and how the evidence was circumstantial. Then she sat down. The judge looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. He picked up his papers and started reading from them. He said he'd reviewed all the evidence and testimony. He said the case against Jolene was strong and based on more than just circumstantial evidence. He said the forensic proof was clear. He said her financial motive was well documented. He said her behavior before and after the fire showed consciousness of guilt. He said burning down a family home was a betrayal of the deepest kind of trust. He said it showed a level of selfishness and disregard for others that required serious consequences. Then he said he was sentencing Jolene to 8 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 5 years. He said she would also owe restitution for the property value, though he acknowledged I probably would never see that money. He said the sentence reflected how serious it was to deliberately destroy a family home for money. Jolene started crying when he said 8 years. The bailiff came over and stood next to her. The judge asked if there was anything else. Liam said no. Megan said no. The judge hit his gavel and said court was dismissed. The bailiff put handcuffs on Jolene and started walking her toward the side door. She kept her head down and didn't look at anyone. I watched her walk across the courtroom and realized this was probably the last time I would see my sister for years, maybe forever. She disappeared through the door and it closed behind her. The finality of it hit me harder than I expected. She was gone. Really gone. Not just angry at me or refusing to talk to me, but actually gone to prison for 8 years. I sat there staring at the closed door. People started gathering their things and leaving. Megan touched my shoulder and I jumped. She asked if I was okay. I nodded even though I wasn't sure. We walked out of the courtroom together and stood in the hallway. She told me the case was officially closed now. She said I wouldn't need to come to court anymore or deal with any more legal proceedings. She said she hoped I could move forward and find some peace. She said she saw a lot of family destruction in her work, and it never got easier to watch. She said she hoped I could rebuild my life and maybe find a way to honor my parents' memory without the house. I thanked her for everything she'd done. She shook my hand and walked away. I stood in the courthouse hallway for a few minutes, not knowing what to do next. Then I walked outside. The November air was cold and gray. I got in my car and drove without really thinking about where I was going. I ended up at Zoe's house. She opened the door before I even knocked. She must have seen my car pull up. She didn't ask how it went or what happened. She just stepped aside and let me in. We went out to her back porch and she brought out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. We sat in her porch chairs and she poured the wine. We didn't talk much. She knew I needed quiet more than I needed someone trying to make me feel better. We just sat there drinking wine and watching the trees move in the wind. After an hour, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. I said no. I said I needed to go home and be alone for a while. She hugged me before I left and told me to call if I needed anything. I drove back to my rental house and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. The next few weeks were strange. I kept expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. The case was over. Jolene was in prison. There were no more court dates or meetings with Megan or phone calls about the investigation. It was just done. I didn't know what to do with that. I started working on the rental house because I needed something to keep my hands busy. I bought supplies at the hardware store and spent my weekends refinishing the hardwood floors. The physical work felt good. Sanding and staining and sealing gave me something to focus on besides everything that had happened. I pulled up the old carpet in the bedroom and found decent wood underneath. I spent 3 days on my hands and knees sanding it smooth. My back hurt and my knees were bruised, but I kept going. When I finished the bedroom, I moved to the living room, then the hallway. The house started looking better. I planted a small garden in the backyard even though it was late in the season. I put in some winter vegetables and hoped they would grow. I bought cheap furniture at thrift stores and fixed up the pieces that were broken. I painted the kitchen cabinets white. I hung curtains I'd sewn myself using fabric I found on sale. Slowly, the house started feeling like it belonged to me, like it was mine and not just a place I was staying temporarily. I started seeing Camilla every Thursday afternoon at her office downtown. The first few sessions were hard because I didn't know how to talk about losing someone who was still alive. She asked me questions about Jolene before everything happened, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time my sister and I had laughed together. Camilla said grief wasn't just about death. She said I was mourning the relationship I thought I had, and the sister I thought Jolene was. We talked about my parents and how I'd been trying to keep them alive through the house. She asked what else I could do to honor them besides preserving a building. I didn't have an answer right away. She gave me homework to think about what my dad and mom actually valued, not just what they owned. The next week, I told her they valued helping people and teaching skills and being useful. She asked how I could do those things. I said I didn't know yet, but I'd figure it out. Over the next month, Camilla helped me see that Jolene's choices weren't about me. She said some people would rather burn everything down than admit they were wrong. She said I couldn't fix my sister and trying to would only hurt me more. It was strange hearing someone give me permission to let Jolene go. I saw a flyer at the hardware store about the community center looking for volunteers to teach workshops. I called the number and talked to the coordinator about teaching basic home repair. She seemed excited and asked what I could cover. I said drywall patching, basic plumbing, how to fix a leaky faucet, replacing outlet covers. She scheduled me for Saturday morning starting in 2 weeks. My first class had 8 people show up. I taught them how to patch holes in drywall and fix a running toilet. One woman told me her landlord charged her $50 every time something broke, and now she could do it herself. A college kid said his apartment was falling apart and this would save him hundreds. Teaching them felt good in a way I hadn't expected. I could hear my dad's voice in my head explaining things the way he'd taught me. After the 3rd class, the coordinator asked if I could do an evening session too, because more people wanted to sign up than could fit in one workshop. I said yes. Every Saturday, I showed up with tools and supplies and taught people how to fix things. Some weeks we did minor electrical work. Other weeks we practiced installing door hardware or fixing squeaky floors. The students asked questions and took notes and thanked me like I was giving them something valuable. I was sharing what my dad gave me, and it felt like keeping him alive in a way that mattered more than a house ever could. 3 months after the sentencing, I got a letter from the state prison. The envelope had Jolene's inmate number printed on it. Inside was a form asking if I wanted to be added to her approved visitor list. There was a box to check yes or no and a line for my signature. I put the letter on my kitchen counter and looked at it every day for a week. Zoe came over for dinner and saw it sitting there. She asked if I was going to respond. I said I didn't know. She asked what I wanted to do. I said part of me thought I should visit because we're family, but most of me knew Jolene would just blame me for everything, and I'd leave feeling worse. Zoe said I didn't owe Jolene anything, especially not my emotional well-being. I thought about it for 3 more days. Then I filled out the form, checked the no box, and mailed it back. I wrote a short note saying I wasn't ready for contact and might never be. I didn't apologize or explain further. I just sent it and felt relieved when it was gone. Zoe helped me go through the box of photos and papers I'd grabbed from the house before it burned. We spread everything out on my living room floor one Sunday afternoon. There were pictures of my parents on their wedding day, photos of me and Jolene as kids, report cards, birthday cards, random receipts my mom had saved. Zoe suggested we make a memory book so I'd have something physical to keep. We went to the craft store and bought a nice album and acid-free pages. We spent the next few weekends organizing everything. Zoe helped me arrange the photos in order and write captions about what I remembered. We included the good stuff and left out anything about Jolene after she turned mean. The book became a record of my parents and the family we used to be before everything fell apart. When we finished, Zoe gave me a hug and said my parents would be proud I was preserving the memories that mattered. I kept the album on my coffee table where I could look at it whenever I wanted. A lawyer called about the restitution payments 4 months after sentencing. He explained that the court had ordered Jolene to pay back the value of the house, but she had no money or assets. He said the state would garnish any wages she earned in prison, which was about 20 cents an hour, so I shouldn't expect to see any real money. I told him I already knew that. He seemed surprised and asked if I wanted to pursue other collection methods after her release. I said no. He asked if I was sure because I was entitled to that money. I told him the money didn't matter anymore, and I'd made peace with the financial loss months ago. What Jolene took couldn't be measured in dollars anyway. He said he'd close the file and wished me well. After I hung up, I felt lighter knowing I wasn't waiting for something that would never come. My parents' anniversary was in June. I bought a small maple tree from the nursery and planted it in my backyard on the morning of what would have been their 42nd anniversary. Zoe came over to help me dig the hole and mix in the soil amendments. We didn't talk much while we worked. When the tree was planted and watered, we stood back and looked at it. Zoe asked if I wanted to say anything. I told the tree about my parents and how they loved each other, and how I hoped it would grow strong and live long. Zoe put her arm around my shoulders, and we stayed there for a while. It wasn't a big ceremony or anything formal, just me and my best friend planting something living instead of mourning something dead. It felt right in a way that visiting the empty lot never had. A year after the fire, I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't dreamed about the house burning in weeks. I used to have nightmares about watching it burn and not being able to stop it. I used to wake up smelling smoke that wasn't there. But somewhere along the way, the dreams had stopped. I also realized I hadn't checked the news about Jolene's case in months. Early on, I'd searched her name every few days to see if there were updates about appeals or parole hearings. Now I just didn't care anymore. The anger I'd carried for so long had faded into something quieter. I accepted that my sister made her choices, and I made mine, and our relationship couldn't survive what she'd done. Some betrayals are too big to forgive, and that was okay. I didn't have to forgive her to move on with my life. I was sitting on my porch one evening in late summer watching the sunset turn the sky orange and pink. The rental house felt like mine now after all the work I'd put into it. The floors I'd refinished gleamed in the fading light. The garden I'd planted was producing tomatoes and peppers. The tree I'd planted for my parents had new growth on its branches. I had my teaching job at the community center, and people who depended on me showing up. I had Zoe and a few other friends who'd stuck with me through everything. I had peace with the past even though it hadn't turned out the way I wanted. Jolene had taken the house and the furniture and any chance of sisterhood. But she couldn't take away the person my parents raised me to be. She couldn't take the skills my dad taught me or the strength my mom showed me. She couldn't take my ability to build something new from what was left. I'd built a good life from the ashes of the old one, and that was enough.